Excellent. So good afternoon, folks, or good morning to the folks west of us. Welcome to our webinar on the state of penetration testing. My name is Mike Opsumer. I'm the Director of Sales here at Parabellix, and I'm excited to have you here with us today. This is a topic that's not only at the forefront of our work here at Parabellix, but also it's a critical focus for organizations looking to strengthen their cybersecurity defenses. As most people know, the landscape of cybersecurity is evolving. It's evolving rapidly, and staying ahead means understanding the challenges and opportunities in areas like penetration testing. So today, we'll dive into insights, some best practices, and innovations shaping this space. Now, to kick this off, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Chief Technology Officer, Eric Matthews. Eric is a thought leader in cybersecurity with a deep expertise in penetration testing and security strategy. He's been instrumental in shaping the solutions and methodologies we offer here at Parabellix, and his insights are always practical, insightful, and thought-provoking, and sometimes entertaining as well. Eric will be leading today's discussion and sharing his expertise on how penetration testing is evolving and what that means for businesses. So let's get this started. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you. Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the QA chat there. We'll address those at the end. In 2025, penetration testing has become more mainstream, but in order to understand better what we do as a pen testing team and to help organizations better understand where the future is going, we really dove into some data for this presentation to look at a variety of different surveys from across the industry. Obviously, we have things like drivers and needs, challenges, the frequency of pen testing, outcomes, and we'll give some some feedback from some insight from our pen testing team and what we're seeing in the market as well. When we look at organizations and their primary drivers for testing, this is a survey about what is the #1 reason for cybersecurity for penetration testing within a cybersecurity organization, and we see kind of what we believe is true from our customers as well. Is the #1 factor here is really just about the cybersecurity validation, validating existing controls, the best practice sort of things that you expect an organization to want to understand. But we also note that the second one here at nearly 20% is a regulatory compliance driver. Cyber insurance, mergers and acquisitions, these are all key factors for driving organizations to do pen testing. I think it's great that a lot of organizations are doing this out of a best practice and diligence to understand their controls better, but obviously we understand that there's a lot of regulatory space in this area as well. When we look at a different survey that's more of a multiple choice, organizations can choose multiple factors that drive their pen testing decisions. We recognize that there's some here, many organizations are looking for specific vulnerabilities. And I think that probably plays a lot more in things like web applications. Maybe there's specific issues that they're looking for in various different pieces of infrastructure. Cloud security is another big one. That's really driving some change, and we'll talk a little bit more about the changes in cloud security. And then obviously testing controls, understanding compliance requirements, these are all big factors. So there's no surprises here. Again, we see M&A diligence at 15%. That's actually higher than I expected to see in some of the surveys, and these are from the last couple of months. That's really interesting given I think a high volume of M&A and the need for driving security during that process. But there's a lot of discussion about cloud security in here as well. When we look at a different survey that has a question of what is value of penetration testing, this has been increasing year over year, and in fact, back a couple of years further. Can we better prioritize our vulnerabilities? Are we supporting our vulnerability management programs? Do we have specific compliance mandates, and are we hitting them? These are actually increasing year over year, which tells me that pen testing is becoming better at addressing the business needs directly, and businesses are starting to appreciate even more. And obviously, I've been in the industry doing pen testing for over 20 years, and it's definitely a different landscape than it was 20 years ago when pen testing was much more of a cowboy sort of activity. I remember a bunch of my coworkers were better known by a hacker alias than their real names, and that's really changed to be more of a corporate-centric, focused on the sort of risk and mandates that you have within organizations of different size and different types. Looking at how many companies are doing penetration testing and how often, 40% of businesses, and that includes small businesses across the board, report using penetration testing. Now, most enterprises are doing it, most larger organizations are, but 40% of business overall. And then we note that of those 40%, a majority are doing multiple per year. And I think that comes across as multiple phases in a lot of cases. Some organizations are doing periodic, semi-annual, or quarterly penetration testing. Others definitely focus on their annual requirement, but maybe then throw in a web app or a mobile app that's part of their portfolio later in the year. So that's where we see the multiple per year. And we definitely have customers who are coming to us 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 times a year for different environments, different applications, and different sorts of initiatives that they have within the organization. So moving on, let's talk about the cause of breaches, because this is really important. And when I plan for what kind of phases, what kind of tests we're looking at and how we want to deliver those and what value we can provide to our customers and to the industry, it's really helps to understand the cause of breaches, because that's without understanding the cause of breaches, we can go off in the wrong direction looking at security from areas that aren't really impactful. So when we're maximizing that dollar for customers and for maximizing the time we spend, that's really important to nail down what the causes are. So one of the things we notice is the exploitation of vulnerabilities as a cause of breaches has been decreasing year over year for a long time. That's down to, according to some surveys, 14 to 23%. Now keep in mind that includes web application vulnerabilities in addition to infrastructure vulnerabilities. However, what has stayed consistent is that human errors are often a part of that. And so, a majority of issues are caused by human errors. And I think it's important to point out that a lot of the human errors we see from our practice are transient, which means they're an issue that can pop up tomorrow. Somebody might notice the issue and fix it 6 weeks from now, but that transient, the transient nature of those issues is really challenging for pen testing when that's a sort of an annual process. And maybe you have throughout the year 4, 5, 6 different times that a transient human error pops up, a mistake in the firewall config, a misconfiguration of a load balancer for a web application. There's a variety of things that come up. Those can come up and then get fixed, and nobody really knows about them except for the person who happened to notice it and fix it. The other key thing we see is obviously use of credentials. And I think this isn't a surprise for anybody in the industry, but somewhere between half and 90% of breaches are caused by stolen credentials. And again, the metrics here vary by quite a bit. I suspect because several of the surveys look at the count of breached records and weight it by that, and the other ones are just looking at the breaches as a 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So the difference between those, the numbers really is insignificant, but we recognize that that's a majority of issues. And then in every survey we found close to a majority of breaches involved web applications, because that's where customer-facing data is stored these days, and it's how a lot of organizations interact with their customer base. When we look at the initial cause, and this is the first entry point, non-error, non-accidental cases specific, is the web application credentials is a primary target. And in fact, you notice the web application is half of, or 65% of all these breaches. Phishing via email is another major one. Phishing is probably the most common type of attack, but in terms of how it, whether it leads to breaches or not, it's lower down the list, partially because it's less successful, it's more of a brute force effort, and also it doesn't always lead to breaches, especially if organizations are diligent with things like two-factor authentication. What we do notice is that exploitation of infrastructure vulnerabilities has fallen off significantly, and that's something we'll talk about more. I also wanted to point out here that 60% of companies lack a cybersecurity incident response plan. This is pretty significant, and it's not pen test related, but what we see from organizations is when they have a breach, a lot of organizations, especially smaller ones, but even up into the small enterprise, don't have a good handle on their cybersecurity incident response plan, and that can be an issue in either responding to issues or really understanding what your risks are, because your response plan hasn't been practiced, and that's something that we recommend everybody focus on. So how have things changed in 2025? Let's talk a little bit about it. I've talked about this for years. the acceleration of cloud migration, something I call the new perimeter. It was something we used 5 years ago to talk about the change in organizations as 52% of companies have migrated the majority of their IT to the cloud, which means this is the first year we can say that most businesses don't have significant on-prem IT infrastructure in terms of servers, services, offices. In some cases, especially for smaller or newer organizations, have started to resemble a coffee shop. If you're in the office, you're there for the collaboration, you're there for the team building, but the office itself doesn't provide any real services other than desks and meeting rooms. 12% more are planning to keep that migration up. This perimeter means that your web applications, your public APIs, your cloud solutions, software as a service, BYOD, these are your perimeter, your endpoints that your company doesn't own, the applications and APIs. So that's the perimeter today. And there's a shift in how we do pen testing to focus on those. Damage from breaches, damage from incidents is rising year over year. We see more nation state organized crime. There's some data on that from some of these surveys. Organized crime was involved in, I think it was between 40 and 60% of financial breaches, and that's a significant thing. Obviously, political drivers have been a thing for breaches, but most organizations aren't being targeted for political purposes. It's primarily financial. 71% and rising year over year had financial motivations. A lot of these are ransomware. They're other kinds of attacks. They're theft of credentials, theft of user info. And then obviously, this is, I think, just a key sort of thought. AI and advanced tools in cybersecurity have increased the rate of change in technology. We had a period for 6 or 8 or 10 years, I believe, that things were a little bit more stagnant. There was obviously a rapid increase in change in the early 2000s. We had a period where things sort of stabilized a little bit. I think we're going to go through another state change in security and in technology in the next few years as AI and some of its offshoots become key to the infrastructure and security. So talking more about penetration testing specifically, because this is obviously where we want to dive into some details. We have this new perimeter. There's some changes to the traditional testing phases, but a lot of them are the same. And I'm going to go through sort of the typical phases that we see in pen testing. I think most of the people on this call who have joined us here will be familiar with the various different phases, but we're going to talk in a little bit of detail about what we're seeing and what surveys are seeing. Obviously, external testing is the sort of old-fashioned key, component of pen testing. It's the most common type of testing in the industry. It's often compliance-driven, and it really involves taking a look as a black box, usually from the outside, no credentials. What does an attacker see? And we've shifted our focus a little bit in this to away from the network-focused testing avenue. The value of doing the traditional cheap pen test, the low service, low quality pen test of run a Nessus scan, report the results on a Word document, just doesn't provide very much value. Maybe you can get away with compliance by having a report like that, but it's very, very, very low value for the business. We noticed that there are 2 areas of risk in the external testing. I see transient risks. These are the risks that pop up for a week or 2, or a mistake that are present until somebody notices that it's a mistake. And then I also see public data risks. So when we look at the external attacks, we see those attacks targeting things like credentials. We talked about that before. We see those targeting web application presence and some of the risks around that area, more than that network focused infrastructure testing that we used to see on the external perimeter. And an anecdote, when I was working in the field in, say, 2004, 2005, we used to penetrate organizations completely from the external presence, probably 30-40% of the time, maybe 20, and that was common, that I was dumping credentials and taking over email servers from the internet. That's not a thing anymore. I haven't honestly seen a complete compromise from an external infrastructure attack in many years of pen testing. We still see it on web apps, but when we see exposures on the outside of organizations, it's breach credentials. That's public data risks, different kinds of credential attacks and different kinds of public data exposures. So we've focused some of our external pen testing practice, probably more than half of the effort of an external pen test these days from our perspective is to really nail down external data attack surface, and that's external risks including public, like breach credentials, dark web mentions, everything from MX records, because I think MX record hijacking is a risk that people should be aware of. It's rare, but it's critical in nature if it happens. Cloud configurations is a big one. Office 365 and G Suite have taken over email. Very few organizations host Exchange anymore. When an organization hosts Exchange, we write it up as a risk, even if we don't find anything on it, because it's such a high profile and vulnerability prone system. And then obviously two-factor authentication and control is key for external surfaces. So anywhere that there's a credential authorization component, you need to have two-factor authentication. And the reality is there are breach credentials every day, all the time. So you really need to stay on top of what your credential exposure is, and then to have that two-factor authentication to prevent them from being used effectively to steal data in the organization. Web application testing, the other component of a good external penetration testing regime. If you're developing web applications or you have web applications you can't confirm have been through thorough testing. So obviously we use a gray box methodology. I think the industry has settled on that pretty thoroughly. It's almost always authenticated because that's where we get the value from actually looking at those web applications. We use a customer level authentication to see if that customer is able to break out and move into other areas of the web application or do other kinds of malicious things like gain access to the database or files or do other kinds of attacks, things that may target other users, cross-site scripting, etc. This is based on the ASVS methodology, the OWASP application security validation standard. There are 3 levels, levels 1 to 3. If you're not familiar with it, you should be, but that's something that we remind customers. If you ever have a pen testing organization come to you and tell you that OWASP Top 10 is a methodology, you should run away. They don't know what they're talking about because it's not, and it can't be used as a methodology. OWASP Top 10 is great as a reference for the the most serious vulnerabilities, but it's not a methodology. It never has been. It doesn't intend to be, and it's I think the default. It's the first question I ask when I'm interviewing pen testers is what's your favorite methodology? And if the OWASP Top 10 comes up, I'm like, oh boy. So one of the things I'll point out here is revision 5 is due out soon. We've been using revision 4. I think it's 4.0.3 right now is the current one, and they update it regularly. Revision 5 is going to change the levels a little bit. For the gray box methodology, we're typically doing level 1. Levels 2 and 3 are more of a crystal box where you're doing either code review or architecture review. ASVS revision 5 is going to lower the barrier for level 1 to make it a little bit more cursory and have level 2 try to be the standard for web application testing. I'm waiting to see if that has code review components or not, but right now I think it does. So there's going to be a funny middle ground there where we have a lower barrier for ASVS level 1, meaning it's a little bit less thorough, but level 2 may include code review or at least review of code security tools. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on, and we'll be looking to talk to customers about that once revision 5 is out, because I think there's some value in really understanding what the where we want to go with the methodology there, what we recommend to customers for their first approach to a web app, and what we recommend to the more mature customers who are looking to dive more into the security. But in our practice, what do we see? And these are actually components, these 3 are components of the OWASP Top 10, and I generally agree with their ranking. But it's helpful, I think, to have a third party who's been in this day in and day out, and the majority of our testing right now is web applications. We still see access control authorization as the key risk in web applications right now. Five years ago, I would have said a parameter sanitization and input validation, and 15 years ago, that was even more the case. We used to get cross-site scripting in probably 60% of the applications, or sorry, SQL injection in probably 60% of the applications that we're testing. Today, we don't see that injection very often. Access control, however, authorization, putting access control on key components of your API and your application, whether it's accidentally exposing an endpoint that maybe pulls a record from the database, or it's having your API that has a replayable token. There's a lot of different risks like this, but these are extremely common in applications, even in modern frameworks. And the modern frameworks for development have largely eliminated things like injection, unless you really fight with them to be able to input SQL directly as a string concatenation. But in the but they allow you to choose your own authorization scheme, and that's really where you can nail some security pieces by being very thorough with the authorization and access control. Obviously, insecure design is also something. File handling is a big piece of this. Cross-site request forgery, cross-site scripting, we still see. File handling, even those have shifted to S3 buckets and cloud-based things, they still have to be controlled in the same way. And we've seen a number of attacks recently in the last few months with customer systems where we're able to upload malicious files and use them to gain cross-site scripting or to do other kind of executable attacks on the environments, because S3 buckets are just file shares really in a fancy way, and you can use those to pivot through different types of attacks. And then obviously misconfigurations. This can be server, can be framework configurations. It's things that we, that should be default but maybe aren't. That can be headers and cookie security and lots of other things like that. Also, TLS SSL issues. Those are common in web apps as well as the external. When we look at the external testing, sometimes TLS and SSL issues are the only thing we find, because the only thing a company's hosting is a web app and nothing else, or maybe a VPN or a gateway of some kind. So obviously web apps were key, and that we talked about the external perimeter, but what about the internal side? Now, companies that don't have internal infrastructure probably don't do this test anymore. If you don't have a server on-prem, and Active Directory is a server, so I'll talk about that in a minute, but this is relevant for the enterprise. The enterprise is still very reliant on on-prem servers and on-prem infrastructure data center. Even those cloud environments, if you do just a lift and shift into the cloud, running VMs in the cloud, this is still relevant. It's not as relevant for that new age organization that's primarily software as a service and containers on the cloud and things like that, where there is no real infrastructure. The IP infrastructure is zero trust, and you have very little. The third parties aren't tested in this way. But lateral propagation, things like ransomware, those are all key to or major issues for the enterprise that have on-prem. When we do on-prem testing, 60% of companies in our testing are compromised within 3 days. So I want to talk about why that is, because almost all of the compromise we get on organizations in internal is based on Microsoft Active Directory and Microsoft protocols. The legacy on-prem Active Directory or hybrid AD requires a very diligent hardening process in order to have that not be a significant risk to the enterprise. Again, the large enterprises we look at much more on top of this, although they have a lot bigger scope. So we're still finding those things. Unpatched systems default configurations, these are configuration mistakes we see a lot of. And I want to point out one thing in pen testing is I've had a lot of customers come to me and say, well, we're really carefully protecting our key database server and our web application server, and we've gone through a ton of work on hardening it, so we don't need to do internal testing. And when we get into those organizations, what ends up happening is something that they didn't expect. We'll go in and find that random dev box that's under some developers, it's a QA box, it's under some developer's desk that he propped up, and the IT guy said, yeah, it's fine, don't worry about it, there's nothing critical on it. That box is vulnerable. We compromise that, we use it to pivot to other servers in the environment that maybe have shared credentials or use Active Directory user credentials. If we pivot around a few times, pretty often we're going to get cached credentials for a domain admin and escalate that to AD. And that's still the case today, and that's been the case for 25 years. There are more tools now to prevent that. There's lots and lots of tools and hardening standards. The local admin LAPS. There's some of the architecture changes, the hardening standards in Microsoft AD that prevent that you can push out by GPO that prevent pivots and that prevent credential reuse. I mean, pass the hash sort of attacks. These are all key, and Microsoft protocols, things like LLMNR and NetBIOS are all, frankly, Windows 3.1 technologies that shouldn't be used anymore, but are on by default because Microsoft really loves backward compatibility, and the customers don't tolerate when their system from 1996 breaks, even though it probably should have been replaced years ago. So that's still an issue and something to really focus on. And then once we're escalating network segmentation, overuse of admin privileges, these are still common in environments internally. And then MDR, XDR monitoring is something that's kind of key to help understand when these breaches happen. So I just mentioned that because we do have a lot of organizations that say, hey, we're testing our security platforms, and we escalate to domain admin and they have no idea that's going on. And they're like, hey, when are you going to start testing? So that's still key and something to keep an eye on. Moving into cloud security, there are new cloud security pen test certifications and at least one methodology out there. The value of those is it's okay. I think what we see from a cloud environment, though, is these are crystal box testing. It's not a gray box. It's not a black box. I can't test other than just testing the sort of VM hardening of your Windows if you're doing a lift and shift in the cloud. We can't really test those without doing a crystal box test. That means we get full access. We're going to get read-only admin on your cloud environment to really nail down how we go in and check those. And that's comes across a little bit more as a gap analysis where we're checking configurations rather than trying to break in. Some of the new cloud pen test methodologies have a couple of scenarios where you can try to break in, but it turns into more of a purple team exercise when you do that to see what the response looks like from cloud admins and what they're seeing, what capabilities they have. Again, two-factor authentication is key, and a couple other hardening things, monitoring and stuff like that. But we're running through this as a gap analysis because I think that's the most effective thing for customers. We still do user-targeted testing, phishing, physical testing. It's worth noting 45% of modern businesses employ security training for cybersecurity. It's lower than I'd like, but higher than I expected, so good. But that's key. Obviously, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of exploits, depending on how you survey it, are involving taking advantage of users somehow. So targeting those users is something that we do as testing. Phishing is still a valid thing. We're still getting, it's probably down from 20 years ago, but we're still seeing, 15%, 10% response rates to very curated phishing attacks. You can use KnowBe4 or whatever for training. Those automated systems are just, I think they're great, and they can really help do some testing. If you want another level of a really curated and targeted phishing attack, we're often registering domains and building custom templates and things like that when we do those to give folks a run and help business leaders understand the risk of that if there's a need from that. So a security team may say, listen, my COO or whoever's in charge of the budget may not believe that phishing's an issue or think that it's a solved issue, so we can come in and demonstrate that risk. Sorry. So operational technology, IoT, things like that. These are industrial controls, and 20% of there's a lot of manufacturing businesses that have these present in their operations, whether it's power and generation or it's manufacturing. There's a lot of different areas that OT is really critical for the business continuity. 20% of businesses with significant OT environments still report limited visibility of security risks. 38% are conducting regular penetration testing on their OT environments. Critical cybersecurity area, but only for those businesses that have significant OT investments and infrastructure, especially when they're business critical. And we've gone through that with some different businesses around North America in terms of critical infrastructure, whether it's manufacturing or power. I was going to mention with OT, one of the things we're seeing there is lack of segmentation is a key factor. I wanted to mention that. Half of the OT environments we've been into had limited segmentation. In other words, half of them were doing best practice of segmenting the OT environments completely. The other half were mixing their IT and OT environments. And OT systems are especially risky in the sense that a lot of them are not built on robust IP stacks. So they have a network stack that may be aging or maybe not well vetted. It's a little surprising how many have something like NT4 embedded or something built into them, or are built on some kind of custom IP stack that even a basic vulnerability scan occasionally will kick over an OT box, and that's can be production critical for an organization, and in a few cases it can be health and safety critical. We've worked in some organizations where an outage of a specific, for example, sensor can be a physical risk of injury or death to workers on the line. So that's a pretty big deal, and making sure those are isolated and that the testing there is done appropriately is really important. You don't want to mistakenly kick over OT boxes in the middle of production cycles. So looking forward, there are we still do manual pen testing. All of our testing for my organization is about that expertise. We're carefully investigating AI penetration testing tools and what they're doing in the industry, and it's something that we want to move toward. But 48% of companies are investigating it, but only 1%, or significantly under 1%, I think, are using it. And that's because the maturity of those tools is still an issue. Internal testing is okay. It's kind of mediocre. It does a kind of good job. There's some areas it's a little aggressive. There's some areas it maybe has blind spots. The external side, again, I've talked about the network testing just isn't that valuable. It's really focused on web apps, and web apps AI testing just isn't very good yet. That's because of the high variability of web applications and the ability to sort of crawl and identify. A lot of web application issues are business logic. It may be appropriate for one web application to expose a certain type of file where the other one really shouldn't, and it's user critical that it's not exposed. And having that contextual awareness is something that AI is still lacking. I expect we're a year, 2, 3, maybe 4 years from seeing that being much better as we get into large language models, and you can sit down and explain to an AI what the business use case is supposed to be. Maybe even walk through a web application with an AI. Can't do that yet. That's where we still have staff. Another interesting one is the testing of generative AI. 75% of businesses are using it, ChatGPT, to make marketing presentations, whatever. 15% are deeply embedding AI in their customer process. Now, we're putting AI as a customer service rep. We're using AI to dig through data. We're using AI to, even in some cases, banks are shifting to use AI for getting access to customer records and explaining that to customers. So you can go to, who did I see it from? I think it was Bank of America, had a chatbot that you could log in and say, how many times have I used my Visa in the last 6 months? And it would say, use this many, and here's the most common things. And you can say, how much did I spend on golf? And it might be able to find out like which of the transactions were which based on contextual knowledge. And that's really interesting, but it's also risky. So security testing of generative AI, especially as it's being put in front of customers or it's being used to reach critical data, is important. There are guardrails around the models to make sure that they don't expose data. You might give the model access to all of the customer transaction data, but tell it that it can only share with that one customer that it's talking about. Now, breaking out of the guardrails in the models, using different kinds of prompting, you can trick those AIs into getting outside their models and doing things that they weren't intended to do. I think we've seen lots of examples in the news about that, but that's kind of important to really understand the models. Prompt obfuscation, there's denial of service attacks against the models to prevent them from functioning. Prompt leaking and some other things like that are things to focus on. So this is a future area that we're doing a lot of research because we have some customers that are asking about it, and we're starting to get into this in terms of testing. And that's something to really be aware of as AI is starting to become pervasive. And then the final piece, we talked about how transient issues were a key factor in especially external risks and public's external attack surface. Continuous testing is a focus that you can use as a technology that you can use to really nail down how to deal with transient issues. Whether you're an application development shop doing continuous application development, or you're just looking to secure your perimeter, having some kind of continuous validation on that is important. And that's really part of what we'll talk about in just a minute. Continuous application testing is, one of the areas we've focused some energy on, and we've developed a couple tools. We have an external attack surface and continuous penetration testing module for the external environments. And then we also have the continuous application testing, which is a little bit focused on code reviews. It's DevSecOps. It's that automated piece that reviews code that automates the security testing during the development of applications and during whether it's code check-in or automated based on when there's a promotion to a new branch. Those are all areas that I think we can focus on if you're a development shop to really get your security in hand, because doing an annual pen test when you're doing an agile development release cycle or say 3-week, 4-week, 5-week sprints, you're really going to miss out on a lot of potential risks there if you're not doing some interim checking and maybe automated. I think only 38% of web dev shops are actually doing penetration testing at all. And 68% have code reviews, but often cursory ones. Using automation, it's 42% of companies are using SaaS tools. Talking about our testing engagements, as an organization, we have really embraced the issues, and we're seeing customers embrace the same issues. External and internal testing have declined significantly over the last 5 years as a need for customers. A lot of the customers we did internal testing on, say 5 years ago, today are coming to us and saying, I don't have any internal. Maybe we have one hybrid AD server and we still recommend testing that. But a lot of those have gone completely software as a service, maybe work from home. Maybe they don't even have an office. Their lease expired. They just never renewed it. So our practice has really shifted to application testing. We've got more cloud testing this year. The external testing, again, I've mentioned, is focused on that public attack surface. That's exposed credentials and DNS records and all sorts of mail hygiene and all sorts of things that are public data, but not necessarily the exposed. What are the holes in my firewall sort of question. And so those will continue to be big, and we're really pushing continuous testing as part of that effort to make sure the transient risks are nailed, even if it's just on the external attack surface. So I think I went through that fairly quickly, but that was our discussion so far, and I think I'm hoping that we have some interesting questions, because we have obviously we go through this a lot. We have a lot of expertise, but I also am interested to hear from the industry. If folks have questions, if there are interesting anecdotes anybody wants to share, please pop up in the QA and put those in for us.
Eric, we do have a question from Igor. Igor says, as far as I know, OWASP ASVS is a set of requirements to follow during application design and build. In my mind, pen testing methodology is a set of methods and approaches and tools used. Please help me understand how ASVS can be used as a pen testing methodology.
Sure, yeah. So ASVS is really focused on all of the different it really is a pen testing methodology. If you look at ASVS level 1, the validation standard level 1, it goes through all of the fundamental risks in a lot of detail. And there's 158 items that are areas to protect against and potential risk areas for applications. So for example, ensuring that access control applies to all restricted endpoints, ensuring that injection isn't SQL injection isn't present on any inputs. Those are each an item on the ASVS detailed checklist, and it's broken up into, I think, 12 different sort of higher level topics. And so ASVS is really fundamentally about making sure it's a validation standard. It's about validating web application code, and it's commonly used, in fact, very commonly used for a vulnerability assessment or a pen test methodology. And again, it can be used internally as a standard that you can hold your testing group to, but it's perfect as a pen testing methodology, and it really does encompass that much better than any other methodology that I've seen.
Thanks, Eric. We've got another question from Nathaniel Rand. Good to see you, Nathaniel. You talked about OT in critical environments, utilities, etc. Do you have any recommendations for organizations that have a minimal OT footprint, like UPS units, building management, etc.?
That's a good question. We often include other infrastructure like UPS, building management things as either a part of an internal test or a phase of an internal testing. Those aren't OT in quite the sense that I would think of in a lot of ways. Your typical like APC power unit doesn't have, it behaves a little bit like an OT system, but on the other hand, it behaves like any integrated firmware, whether it's a phone or a printer. They function a lot the same way. OT environments, the traditional sort of big iron manufacturing systems, have hatching restrictions. They have sort of validation restrictions that, and this is especially prevalent in healthcare, which we don't often call OT, but it really should be when medical devices. They don't get patched. They run on ancient systems because nobody wants to risk updating them. Whereas things like your power supplies, UPS, the APC UPS is the most common brand. We see that a lot. Those are really just firmware systems that are comparable to like an IP phone, and they're easy to patch. They have patches available often. Their configuration settings are pretty simple. So I'd recommend treating those as ancillary components in an internal test, making sure that you obviously go through hardening practices, but that's true of your phone systems and cameras that do presentations. I'm trying to think of all the things we see on internal testing that have the similar risk profile, because UPSs are absolutely a thing. They often have web interfaces, and organizations extremely commonly forget to harden those. Default password, default credential, default SNMP strings. Some of those, I think they've stopped doing it now, but some of them even had SNMP that you could break into them. You could take over and control them using a private SNMP string, which SNMP v1 is just clear text with a community string is the only validation. So it's terrible security, but we still see those out there sometimes. Granted, the newer firmwares don't enable SNMP by default, and a lot of them restrict it to SNMP v3, which is authenticated and encrypted, but definitely still seeing those out there. Treat them as any other device that needs to go through hardening. And again, having a good inventory on the internal network is also key. When we look at best practices around infrastructure hardening, inventory is one of them. So having an understanding of your internal attack surface is important there. Internal attack surfaces shift and morph and change as people come on and off the network and somebody installs a printer. So it's a little bit more challenging to have, for example, an automated attack surface management tool. They'll be really noisy and difficult to track, but still a good idea to have inventory and manage that, and at least make sure that you have a knowledge of those permanent installations, like building management and UPS and things like that. And it was a long way of saying just these are sort of standard business practices, and I think they are business utilities, and I think they can be treated like that. They can be treated as part of the network, an internal network. In rare cases that like building management things can't be, and this is a recommendation with medical devices and OT devices, is pursue segmentation, like zero trust segmentation for devices, especially those that can't be patched easily. If you have a big iron air conditioner, HVAC control unit that can't be patched and is really old, segment it. That's just the easy answer, and it's true for heart monitors and dialysis machines and things we see in hospitals, because those are often atrocious security because they can't be patched. The FDA, the medical regulatory or agencies don't allow those to be just arbitrarily patched by users. So they have to go through a release and testing cycle every time there's a patch, which means they get very slow patches on the security side.
Eric, I just received a question by a text message, which is
okay.
Sure. So the question is about the actual user devices, such as laptops, and the EDR, MDR agents running on those. So how would those be tested during the internal penetration testing cycles? And the second part of the question is obviously, which EDR vendors do you think are better than other EDR vendors?
Yeah, well, you want me to pick favorites? We do endpoint protection in general is important, and we definitely see an impact from that. Organizations that don't have good endpoint protection are easier to compromise because endpoints tend to not be as hardened as servers. That said, we've done some testing on various different EDR platforms, and I, we're able to bypass some, and it depends on the revision. Like this is an arms race to some extent. We've got at least I've got 2 guys on my team that are sort of really into this and do it as a hobby to dive into bypassing protections and really understanding what we can do in terms of breaching systems that have those protections. A lot of the time, newly patched systems, and I want to say like CrowdStrike Falcon is one that stands out sometimes as a good system that's difficult to bypass or impossible to bypass most of the time. There are other endpoint protections that aren't as effective. And there are some bypasses that are effective on the sort of base version of Windows Defender as of 3 months ago or so. I think they patched some of that. So again, this is kind of an arms race, and it's difficult to say, but in any given month, there may be one vendor over another based on whatever vulnerabilities out right now or whatever bypass methodologies seen. So that's a tricky question, and but I have had good luck with CrowdStrike in general. Absent their outage issue a while back, but I don't want to play favorites too much because there are a fair number of good solutions out there.
We got a couple more questions. I've got one from Saeed that says, lots of my clients are asking for pen testing from a wireless point of view. How do you see it possible if you do it remotely?
Okay. We do some wireless pen testing remotely. It has to be a limited scope. If I want to do a very thorough wireless pen test, I'm usually looking for rogue access points first. So I'm actually walking a building, and if it's a large facility, you're not going to see it from a single location. So if I can get somebody on-prem, there is a better result. And we've been doing that for years. We also do some signal mapping when we do on-prem Wi-Fi to make sure that we've covered, we understand how far away the access point's reachable. Again, with antennas that can vary. I've got a big parabolic, I've got a 3-foot parabolic antenna I use I was sitting on the island off the coast of Toronto and picking up signals from all of the high rises, and I can aim it at different parts of the buildings and see different Wi-Fi signals. So, range isn't, but we always map that. When you can't be on-prem, we'll ship a Wi-Fi device with I have one here. Actually, I don't want to run off and grab it. It's just on my table over there. But we ship a Wi-Fi device with our internal sensor. And so we do a lot of internal tests with a remote sensor. Somebody says, hey, I'm in Yellowknife. I want to do internal pen testing. I'm not going to fly somebody up there typically. So, we're going to look at that with an external sensor device to do a third-party sensor device, like a little Linux box that will ship up and has a connect back to our lab. We can ship a Wi-Fi device with that and do Wi-Fi pen testing on what we can see from that location. So the long and short is, yes, we can do it, but we can't do as much roaming around to determine the extent of the signal and discovering as many rogue access points around the facility. But if it's a small office, we can usually see the whole thing and do testing on the Wi-Fi, the corporate authorized Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi signals that are supposed to be there. We can help organizations nail that down. The risks we see in Wi-Fi today, just as an aside, WPA2 is still common with like either PSK or Enterprise. Both have vulnerabilities. WPA PSK pre-shared keys. You can obviously capture the handshake and then attack the cipher. It's not always successful because it's salted. So that's a challenging hack, but with a high performance cracking box, we can break certain passwords. They have to be high complexity if you're using PSK, and even then, make sure it's not dictionary based. There's some challenges there because you obviously want it easier for users to enter, but difficult for attackers to crack. So there's some nuance there. WPA3 has fixed a lot of that, so that's an area to migrate to if you can support it. WPA2 Enterprise. Has some risks, but it's more around attacking the Radius servers and the authentication servers backing that. So if we can do things like an evil AP attack where we'll prop up an AP that's spoofing the SSID name, the network name of the targeted network, and then set an evil Radius server so that valid clients, like legitimate employees, will log in and then ask for authentication, and we can say, yeah, sure, I'm the server, and then they send us their passwords. So that's easy enough. You can get around that with certificate control. In other words, you need to have trusted certificates on your Radius endpoints. In most operating systems, the user will get a pop-up that says this is an untrusted authentication server. Are you sure you want to proceed? And you can actually push a GPO to a Windows box that will prevent it from ever asking that and just refuse to authenticate to an untrusted Radius server. But that's not a default configuration because you have to trust the certificate. So usually it only works if you have corporate endpoints, and you can put a corporate certificate CA, signing authority, and then make sure the certificate is part of that certificate chain, and then you can force the laptop to or the device to use only that trusted certificate chain. A little bit complicated. Honestly, better to go to WPA3 if you ask me.
So I'm not going to comment on the creepiness of being on the Toronto Island with a parabolic antenna, but I do have a follow-up question from Igor. Is manual testing useless in an agile DevOps environment? Do you have any recommendations to perform security testing during DevOps?
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not useless. Absolutely not. The reason is that your diligent sort of gray box pen testing uncovers things that you'll never find with another tool. There's no alternative that I can think of. So some organizations we work with, when they have major releases, which is sometimes up to 2 or 3 times a year, we'll do pen testing on those, and that's prohibitively, resource intensive for some organizations, recognizably. So those are important steps in the validation process. But a real DevOps environment should include a layer of tools. And I don't have it open. I wish I did. I have a roadmap of, not a roadmap, call it a phase diagram, but through, planning, architecture, development, release, maintenance, and where testing on a DevOps cycle fits. Because further back in the process, you can do threat modeling. When you're architecting the system, do threat modeling. When you're developing, do static code analysis, SAST. When you're releasing, you can implement some kind of DAST if it's practical for your system. They're high maintenance, they require babysitting, but implementing DAST solutions. Software composition analysis fits maybe in between there, where you can understand your software supply chain. So these are all areas that you can make sure that you have integrated into your DevOps, preferably automated. You can do that on code check-in. That's a little burdensome. A lot of organizations will have the test done but not block the release, which is maybe okay. Some organizations that are extremely careful will actually have a gate where you have to pass a certain threshold of below a certain threshold of vulnerabilities before you can even promote code to a say a QA branch or something like that. So a developer has to fix things before they even anybody else in the organization even sees them. That's a real headache for developers, especially when there's false positives. SAST and some kinds of SaaS tools and certain SCA components have a high false positive rate. So we actually have a product that we sell, and I don't want to dive in. This isn't the right place for it, but we have a product we sell that's like a turnkey DevOps solution that does SAST and SCA, and then we do the triage and prioritization so that if your team is short on like DevSecOps expertise, the goal there is really to publicize or to give the developers a hit list. Like, here's the 5 items you can fix in your next sprint, and they don't have to think about the other 90 that are on the list. And typical when you turn on an SCS, software composition analysis and supply chain testing tool, is you'll get 200 vulnerabilities, and 180 of them will be high severity, because that's how CVSS works. That sucks, because developers have to then sit down and spend weeks. Usually if you don't have a DevSecOps person, it's going to be your like senior architect or somebody who gets paid a lot of money. They have to sit down and pour through each one and figure out what's the biggest priority. So the solution we have will kind of turnkey, installs all the tools, takes about an hour of developer time, and then gives prioritized remediations for given sprints. And that's something that we're offering. But if you're going to do it yourself, you can do the same thing. There are open source tools. They're a little harder to manage. Their reporting kind of sucks. Or you can go with the commercial tool sets, Checkmarx, Synopsys, Veracode. Those are great solutions. Typically budget for 6 figures in a lot of cases. Sometimes they're half that, but they typically, number of developers is a key. Sometimes lines of code, kind of depends on which platform you're going with, but those are your options.
Thanks, Eric. And just to add to this, Igor, one of the things that you have to look at strategically is how you're layering your security testing during the software development lifecycle. One of the things to consider is, look, the automated DevOps tool, it's really more of the iterative testing. However, you still need to have some kind of safety net when you're doing your application security testing. So your manual testing, as well as whatever you're doing in preparation for the entire test cycle, such as the threat analysis, it's really something that it's your safety net. You cannot really do one without not doing another. Your testing is going to be incomplete. As simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think we're out of questions. I'm going to just end with a couple of thoughts. I think penetration testing isn't going away. obviously it's our business, but just as a neutral observer, if I try to be, the security testing with a human is still a key component in understanding an organization's security footprint. Microsoft protocols on-prem AD is one of the key risks I see right now, outside of obviously web applications and that. And so that's something to really keep an eye on. We do AD assessments sometimes just as a standalone thing, but it's also part of internal testing. The hardening around AD is pretty key, and so don't miss that. Don't miss the Microsoft protocols. The legacy protocols within Microsoft are still risky. So that's a pretty big deal. And then obviously, if you're developing web applications, you need to embark on a complete security program from architecture through development. Writing code, getting to the end state, hoping to release it to customers isn't great without doing periodic different security tests throughout the process. We definitely still have customers that come to us and say, hi, we need to do pen testing because our customer release is in 7 days. Can we do testing? We haven't done any security. And I'm going to quietly roll my eyes and say, yeah, but we're going to find things, and you're going to be set back weeks in re-architecting and re-solutioning your code, because I can just, it's that old adage of, a developer doesn't write code that fixes the compiles on the first try. It never happens. I talked to a developer once who said that happened once, and he thought he was in the Twilight Zone when he wrote like 100 lines of code and it compiled right away. He was like, so what happened? Something's wrong. Same thing with security. You have so much risk, so many small things that can happen that you really have to go through the ASVS, even as a developer, and use that as a validation. That's great if you want to do that internally, but nailing that as an external third party can be really beneficial too, because our team, a team like ours brings the expertise to really understand what is cross-site request forgery and how is it attacked, what is it, how do you fix it, what's the risk of cross-site scripting, and if I don't secure my cookies, what's the risk there, and how can we exploit that? And there's a lot of different pieces, and there isn't a ton of people that are both developers and have enough expertise in software security to do that audit, and it may be not worth their time if they are that kind of person. So that's just something to think about.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate that. I appreciate the presentation and your insight. It's really great to hear your perspective on these critical topics, and thank you for everybody for joining us today. We're at the end of our time. We hope you found the session valuable and that it's given you some fresh ideas and approaches to consider for your own cybersecurity strategies. Before we wrap up, I want to mention again that we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar along with some additional resources, so keep an eye open on your inbox. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about how Parabellix's penetration testing team can help uncover vulnerabilities and strengthen your security posture, or if you'd like to explore any of the topics that we've discussed today a little bit further, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact us directly or hit us on our website for more information. Thanks again for spending your afternoon with us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.